Well, Aaron had asked me to talk a little bit about some of the background to Prometheus. And I thought it'd actually be useful to take a look at this question of what the Greeks were dealing with, what Aeschylus came out of. Because I think most of you know the Prometheus story. There are all sorts of things you could say about it. And maybe I will say a couple of things directly about Prometheus. But I think one of the things that's most striking, if you look at what Lynn's been talking about in the recent period, is this question of the immortality and the effect of taking up this question of immortality for policy, as a policy question. You know, today we were having a discussion about why is it at a moment where the crisis is so clear, Larry Summers is out, they don't know who's going to come in, the financial system's blowing up, there's more unemployment, everything's going on. We have a completely simple, elegant solution to the problem. Get rid of Obama, Glass-Steagall, Nawapa, and everything's fine. So why is it that people don't get it? What is the problem? And Lynn, the last couple of days, has come back with this tragedy question, partly because Robert was here, there's some work going on it, but that's been Lynn's discussion for a long time. So if you look at this question of tragedy and organizing, and what I thought was important in some of the discussions I had with phone teams today, is why aren't we discussing this question of tragedy? Now then Lynn had this consistently increased discussion about Don Giovanni. And you know, you could be cynical and say that Lynn gave up on the Ave Virum and said, okay, let's try something that's more obvious. But you know, let's be generous and say that's not what he's doing. What he laid out in the last couple of days on the Don Giovanni is really fascinating. This question of leadership. And if you think about the Mozart question, here you have one of two people, Mozart and Da Ponte, the two of them, the only ones in Vienna at the end of the 1780s who had the guts to tell the truth. You know, 4 years or 3 years earlier, the emperor was pushing what were equivalent of American system reforms. Joseph II kicked the Jesuits out of the education system. He was doing some land reform. He was actually doing some promotion of a certain kind of national banking and also industrial policy. He was moving against the nobility. And the nobility wanted them to get back involved in the Turkish wars. And so they brought Mozart in with the abduction from the Seraglio to, in a sense, shame the Christians of the Habsburg Empire by showing that the Pasha in the Muslim world had a much better humane sense of charity and generosity than the Christians, and actually had an impact. Then with the marriage of Figaro, prior to the French Revolution, the idea that you demonstrate the absolute corruption of the nobility, but also the humanity of the servants, of Figaro, of Susanna, and that they could form alliances and actually take on the oligarchy. So you had Mozart working with some people in the court, von Born, von Swieten, and Joseph II himself. But by the time they're ready to do Don Giovanni, you'd had a shift in Europe. First of all, the American Revolution was very much on everybody's mind. By 1786, 87, people were really thinking about this. What does this mean? What does it mean for the Habsburg Empire? What does it mean for Prussia? What does it mean for France? You had American system reformers in all these countries. And then you had Da Ponte and Mozart, who were part of the broader networks, at least in some ways connected to the Benjamin Franklin operations being run into France and Germany. And so it looked like this was an opportunity for change. And what happened? They got smashed. There was an operation run. The Queen's Necklace, which was run through this guy Cagliostro, who was a Venetian operative, was deployed into France to destroy any sympathy there might be for the Queen, who, Queen of France was Marie Antoinette, the sister of the Emperor Joseph II of Austria. At the same time, you had this guy Casanova running around in Vienna, basically a high-class pimp. You know, Casanova is known through history as the guy who slept with so many women, but he was running a series of brothels. And David is doing some work on this. He's actually done some things that show that maybe Joseph II, whose second wife, I believe, had died at this time, that Joseph fell into the honey traps being set for him by Casanova. So you had an attack on the French government by Cagliostro and an attack on the government in Vienna by Casanova. And it's around sex and degeneracy. And it's at this moment that Da Ponte and Mozart say, we've got to address this. We've got to go deeper into the question of the corruption. Now, look, the corruption of Don Giovanni is pretty obvious. You know, the first time you see him, he's raping someone and killing her father. So there's no question. It's sort of like Richard III. You know, how does Shakespeare set up Richard III? You first see him, he says, I hate peace. With this hump on my back, I was born for war. Dogs bark at my shadow when I pass by. I hate the piping times of peace, like my brother. And then he says, plots hath I laid, conspiracies unfurled. And then 2 minutes later, he says to his brother Clarence, oh my gosh, they're throwing him into the Tower of London. Don't worry, I'll take care of you. And Clarence says, thank you, thank you. And as he goes away, he says, yeah, we'll take care of you. We're going to kill you. So there's no question at the beginning, Richard III is a completely immoral scumbag. What's the rest of the play about? The compromise is made by everyone else. People who knew Richard was no good. The woman who he's standing over the corpse of her husband, and he's also killed her father. And he says, I'm going to marry you. And she spits in his face, and in the next scene, they're married. Buckingham, Hastings, one after another, capitulate. So it's the compromise with evil. So Don Giovanni's the same way. And Mozart knew Shakespeare. He knew it through Schikaneder and the traveling theater companies that were organized by Lessing. And so what do you have with Don Giovanni? A guy who's an unrepentant scum from the very beginning. But the real story, as Lynn always talks about, is the tragedy of the whole society. And you see it throughout. You see it with Don Ottavio, who seems like a decent guy, and at one point someone says, I think it was Donna Anna, says, that voice, it was Don Giovanni. And he said, Don Giovanni? But he is a nobleman. That kind of corruption. The scene you were working on last night, Matthew, the Zerlina Don Giovanni, where she's clearly conflicted, but the idea, nice house, well, he does seem like a gentleman. We're told not to trust them, but maybe he's proposing marriage, who knows? The corruption, the whole society, and it's really clear in a couple of cases. One is the case of Leporello, who really should be seen as a complete and total degenerate. On the one hand, he doesn't like Don Giovanni because he keeps him waiting outside in the cold while he's inside porking the women. But then what else does he say? He loves the fact that it's going on. It's just that he wishes he could get in on some of the action. And that the catalog aria, as Lynn points out, this is the highest evil. Here's the guy gloating about his master sleeping with 1,002 in Italy and 300 in Turkey and on and on and on. In the face of a woman who is coming to make Don Giovanni an honest man. Now, it was good for her to see this, but it didn't stick because she still thinks maybe you can change Don Giovanni. So you see, it's the whole society. And in case you missed the point, at the end of the opera, after Don Giovanni, an act of supernatural extravagance occurs. A statue. Think of it. Guy's killed in the morning. They already have his statue on his grave. And the statue marches into the house and takes Don Giovanni straight to hell. And the people who are involved, after they see this, they sing about how their lives are going to be just the same as they were. They're going to have to do a little contrition, maybe. But Zerlina and Macedo want to go home to dinner. Donna Elvira wants to go to a nunnery. And Leporello wants to search for another master, maybe a little better one who would give him sloppy seconds. Mm-hmm. So, you look at this thing and you see it's the society that's degenerate. Now, this question of tragedy, what we were talking about in the organizing today, is how do you communicate this to a population which is not really clear on the tragedy? And Lynn made the point, look, my own boomers are not so clear on this. Some of them actually don't think we're about to have what Lynn is forecasting, the hyperinflationary blowout. The Federal Reserve, here's another $2.3 trillion. Well, that's, so far it hasn't blown out.
Okay.
So you have this mentality of accepting the conditions. And so what Lynn was saying in terms of tragedy is not, let's just talk about tragedy and, you know, all be so impressed with Mozart and Shakespeare and Schiller and Aeschylus. But how do you use these as active organizing principles? The way Mozart intended, the way Schiller intended. Schiller makes it clear in his essays on tragedy that he intends to use this to make the audience better. So in our organizing, why aren't we using this? Now, how do you do that? You have to think of the person on the other end of the phone or at the table as someone in the balcony of a theater. And you have to draw them in to see the tragedy. And what's the tragedy? Obama? Obama's not a tragic hero or a tragic figure. He's a bum. He's a puppet. The tragedy is that people, 80% of whom want him out, will bitch and moan, and then they won't give $5 to a movement that's out to get rid of him. So this is where the tragedy comes in. Now, I wanted to take a look at, in a sense, the real birth of tragedy. Not Nietzsche's idea of the birth of tragedy in the Dionysian dancing and the ecstasy of the sex orgies that Nietzsche apparently was so intrigued with. But the real birth of tragedy is Homer. Homer's discussion of what happened around the Trojan War. Now, often, you know, I've discussed this a lot, the importance of Homer, and I usually focus on the Iliad, because that's the one that, if you look at Aeschylus, Aeschylus writes a lot about the actual discussion and the period around the Iliad, which is the Trojan War, where Agamemnon raises troops to go in and vindicate his brother Menelaus, whose wife Helen was taken off to Troy. And so you have the story of the Trojan Wars. Now, this was really brutal. It starts in brutality. It's a kidnapping. But anyone in Greece at the time knew that what they were talking about was the house of Atreus. And the house of Atreus was sort of like the Bush family, you know, except it was open cannibalism. You know, the family feuds start with one brother feeding the other brother's children to him in a pie for dinner. And a cycle of vengeance that makes the Hatfields and McCoys look like amateurs. You have the house of Atreus, one generation after another, killing the previous generation and the future generations. And this is the house of Agamemnon and Menelaus. And they go up there, and what's the first thing that happens? In order to go to the war, they need to do a sacrifice to the god Neptune to calm the seas. And so they take the daughter, Iphigenia, and sacrifice her, kill her, to appease the god Neptune so the waters will be calm so they can sail up to Troy and carry out butchery. You have all these stories in there, but the real story in the Iliad is it's the wrath of Achilles. It's the story of Achilles. And the story of Achilles is about immortality. You know, he was at birth, his mother was promised, your son can either do something very brave and die young and be immortal, or live a long, boring life. And so this was part of the question of what was going to happen. And of course, Achilles is a real nutcase a lot of the time. He's pouting, he's moping. He's upset because Agamemnon stole his concubine, the woman he thought he captured to have. I mean, it's really brutal if you read it. It's a really ugly, nasty story of people who have no sovereignty, who turn to the gods for everything. And included in this is the figure Odysseus, who in the Iliad is not a particularly good guy. Odysseus didn't even want to go. He pretended he was crazy so that he could be kept out of the army. Now, he was the king of Ithaca. And here you have the king of one of the allies of Athens who didn't want to go fight in the war, and he hooked up his plow, I think it was to a cow and a bull or something, so they had different gates so the plow wouldn't work. And he was out there in the field plowing in a way that it wouldn't work, so people would think he was crazy, so he wouldn't be drafted, basically. and one of the people who didn't like him exposed it. Later, when he finally gets to Troy, he has the person who exposed him stoned to death because he sets him up to make him look like he stole some gold. So you have brutality throughout. Now, the story of Achilles, he's finally driven to fight because his best friend, Patroclus, is killed in battle. And so he goes out and he gets the son of the king of Troy, Hector, and not just kills him, but then chains him to a chariot and rides around with the dead body around the walled city. I don't remember exactly how many times, but until the body is totally disfigured.
He did it every day for like the 11 days he mourned for Patroclus after he killed him.
Yeah, and I think it was from sunrise to sunset he was doing it. Yeah. So the body is left there as, the hamburger. But Achilles is moved when eventually the king, the father of Hector, the king of Troy, comes into his tent and asks for the body. And at that point, you see a potential quality of humanity in Achilles, but not really. Now, Odysseus, by the way, was the one who came up with the Trojan horse story, the Trojan horse idea. But it's a brutal story. But then you get to the second story, the Odyssey. And you begin to see a change. You begin to see Homer presenting an idea or a series of ideas of a real change which led to the birth of Greek society, led to the birth of Athens. That, I think, and then also Aeschylus' story of the Orestian trilogy, which I'll get to in a moment. But in the second one, the Odyssey, it starts where you have a story being told about what had happened to Odysseus after the Trojan War. 10 years, the war is over, and on his way back, all his ships are smashed in terrible seas. And he goes through one crisis after another, one problem after another. Finally, he's captured by Calypso, a goddess, who decides to keep him as basically a sex slave. And at a certain point, Athena is a little upset about this and goes to Zeus and asks Zeus, can we get him out of there? And so they go down and they basically tell the goddess Calypso, you got to let him go. And but if he wants to go. Now, the point about Odysseus is that he's been through all these crises, ships sinking, mutiny, sailors eating forbidden meat, all kinds of things, having to deal with the Cyclops. And and you see the problem. You see that Odysseus is a flawed character. He's not a great, honorable man. After he blinds the Cyclops, he gets in the ship and goes off to sea, and as he's leaving, he says, "You've been blinded by King Odysseus." He'd been using a pseudonym because he didn't want the Cyclops to know who he was. And then as he's leaving, he's bragging about who he is. And the Cyclops' father is Neptune. And so Neptune smashes all the remaining ships and drowns all the rest of the sailors with Odysseus because pride, hubris, is a sin. So you begin to see how this is unfolding, and he ends up on this island. It's not a bad island. He's living in a cave, but it's a pretty nice cave with a beautiful goddess. And as Zeus intervenes and says, if you want to leave, you can. She says, if you stay, I'll make you immortal, like the gods, and you'll be forever young. So you have this theme quite often, mortality, immortality, aging, the gods, and the relationship of the gods and the Titans, and then the mortals. And Odysseus, even while he's with Circe for 7 years, with a beautiful goddess, with all that he could want, he's still thinking about his wife and his son. And he says he wants to leave. And she's not all that nice. She says, well, I'll give you some tools, you can make a ship, but I'm not going to give you a ship. So he has to build a ship, and he has to navigate, and he has to go between Scylla and Charybdis. He's got all these additional tests coming up. But here's the irony on this question of mortality and immortality. The irony for him is that he was offered immortality the easy way. The goddess said, you could be immortal by my act. You could be with me forever, you'll be a god forever, and so on and so forth. And he chose not to. because of his love of his homeland and his love of his wife, Penelope, and his son. Now, he didn't even know if they were still alive. This was almost 20 years later. But he went back, and he had to go through some more tests. Meanwhile, what was happening to his wife? She had 108 suitors. 108 guys were demanding, they were saying, your husband's dead, we want to marry you, because they wanted to be the king. And finally, when he gets back, and he tells her who he is, and they discover, yes, she's still alive, he's still alive, then he goes out and kills the 108 suitors and takes over again. But Athena has to intervene because the townspeople, the people of Ithaca, where the 108 suitors came from, are a little bit angry. And so Athena intervenes, and what does she say? She says, no more revenge. No more revenge. Let him live, and let him be a good ruler. Now this is very similar to what Aeschylus does with the Orestian trilogy. The point about Homer, before I get to Aeschylus, the point about Homer is that all these themes of the classics, questions of foresight, of forecasting, of the corruption of the gods, the corruption of the mortals, the sacrificing daughters to calm down the seas, things of that sort. All of these stories are there for the people from Homer's time, which is the 8th century BC. And these are not just, as Lynn said, myths, but they're real people, real stories. We know now there was a Troy. We know there was a Trojan War. Homer didn't make it up. What Homer was talking about is why there was a dark age in Greece, because of this kind of reaction of revenge, vengeance, the question of physical beauty, Helen of Troy. Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships? Or as my mother used to say when she grabbed me in the morning, she'd say, is this the face that sank 1,000 ships? Or broke a couple cameras? So all these stories, the question of physical beauty, Achilles, perfect warrior, except he's a psych job. The guy is pouting during the whole war because the slave that he stole for his mistress was taken by the king. And when he finally goes out to fight, he fights in a battle which has been foretold he'll be killed because of his one weakness, namely his Achilles heel. The one place where when he was dipped as a baby in a way that would protect him to make him immortal, they had to hold him somewhere, and they held him by the Achilles heel. And so that was the one part of his body that was vulnerable. So you have these beautiful stories, the stories of the gods and the stories of the mortals and the clashes. Were all there for a purpose. To educate the Greeks about what? About the tragedy of human life and about the necessity of creativity. Because what ultimately saved Odysseus was being creative, learning to navigate by the stars, learning to build instruments that could help him get through perilous journeys, and then secondly, love, loyalty. The higher quality that you want in a king. And you see this again in Aeschylus' story of the Orestian trilogy. Mm-hmm. You see the big hero of the Trojan Wars, Agamemnon, the big macho king, the one who's stealing the mistresses of all his leading generals, the one who himself was very often cowardly and was threatening to leave. Mm-hmm. The troops are there, and Agamemnon says, I'm out of here. If you guys don't fight the way I want you to fight, I'm leaving. So he's the big hero. Meanwhile, he steals one of the daughters of, I think, Priam, Cassandra. And he doesn't quite understand what it means for her to be a Cassandra. She was the original Cassandra. The idea, she was cursed because she wouldn't accept Zeus's deal to be one of Zeus's concubines. So Zeus cursed her, Cassandra, that she would have the gift of forecasting. But no one would believe her. So, of course, she warned them, don't let the Trojan horse come into the walls of the city. No one believed her. And she said to Agamemnon, as he's taking her back with him at the end of the war, don't take me back. Don't go back to Clytemnestra, your wife. It's going to end badly. Of course, Agamemnon didn't believe her. Mm-hmm. But if you read the Orestian trilogy, it's got this beautiful opening of a watchman 10 years the war is going on. This is a guy, he's got one of the worst jobs in the world. You know, it's a job sort of like the guy hired by Obama to track the recovery. For 10 years, every night, he sits out there waiting for the string of lights from Troy to be lit so he can say, they're coming back, the war is over. You know, it's sort of like the joke about the schnorrer and the Jewish shtetl who can't get a job, and finally he comes home, he's really excited. He said, I got hired, I have a job. And his wife said, yeah, big shot, what'd they hire you to do? And he said, I'm supposed to sit at the gates of the city and be there to greet the Messiah when he arrives. She says, what the hell kind of a job is that? What does it pay? And he says, a shekel a month. She says, what kind of a job is that? And he said, it's steady work. So here you have these night watch, sitting out there, waiting for the lights to come on. And this play opens where they see the lights. The lights are there. So everything starts to come alive, and everyone realizes Agamemnon's coming back. Well, meanwhile, unlike Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, who was faithful, who fought off the suitors, who insisted that her husband was coming back alive, Clytemnestra took on a boyfriend. And so the crisis there is, here comes Agamemnon. He's warned not to come back. He comes back, and he gets killed in the first 5 minutes of the play.
By her.
Yeah, by her, by Clytemnestra and her Sylvester Stallone boyfriend.
He was the cousin of Agamemnon.
Yeah.
He was seeking revenge for
It's
his
all in the family. Yeah, because Agamemnon had killed people in his family. Plus, Clytemnestra was kind of pissed off because Agamemnon sacrificed her daughter, Iphigenia. Revenge, vengeance, blood, gore, guts. This is what the society was like. Like South Central LA today. Like the world today. You know, a tragedy. And what intervened in the Orestian trilogy? Well, Orestes, the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, gets organized to go kill Clytemnestra. That's the cycle of revenge. And he goes and he kills his mother and her boyfriend. And then the Furies come after him. And he's about to be punished. And so he has to go on trial. And he goes on trial, and you know, the gods try to cover his ass. Apollo comes in and says, no, I told him he could do it. And you know, just cop a plea, tell him the gods said it was okay, and you're all right. But Orestes had some honor. And Orestes said, no, I did it. Yes, Apollo told me I could, but I made the decision. And this moved enough people on the jury that they had a hung jury. So it got thrown to Athena. And Athena made a ruling that was highly controversial. What Athena said is that because he took responsibility, this could end the cycle of violence. When you finally say revenge is not a good motive, then maybe you're capable of ruling. So she said, I'm going to acquit you. I'm going to set you free. And you're going to become a wise ruler of this kingdom. And the Furies went nuts. The Erinyes, they went nuts. They wanted the pound of flesh. They wanted him punished. And so Athena said to them, you should stop being the Furies and become the Eumenides, the guardians of mercy and justice. And you'll rule over this city and make Athens, my city, Athena's city, a city of justice, a city of mercy. And Orestes will be a good king, and you'll back him up. Now, if you think about from Homer to Aeschylus, you have 400 years. You've had a lot that's happened. You had the intervention of Solon to save Athens with a debt moratorium and with an idea of men, not gods. That you can't give up your responsibility by saying the gods made me do it. I had to go to the oracle. I had to go to Delphi. And by the time of Aeschylus, you actually have the beginning of a nation, a city-state. And the way Aeschylus took these stories, he took the stories that everybody knew and he put human characters in them. And they would have these festivals of Dionysus would be, every year there'd be 2 or 3 weeks where they'd have festivals that would be, the highlight of which would be tragedies, plays. And the whole town would come out in these amphitheaters and see the plays. And they'd see the story unfold. Imagine the pride of the citizens of Athens, that their city was created because the goddess Athena said, you must be the guardians of justice. Because who were the Eumenides? The people in the stadium were the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, 20 generations later, the Furies who were turned into the guardians of justice. And so this was the way the tragedy was overcome. The idea that the citizens have to take the responsibility. Now, in this context, you look at the question of the role of immortality and the way this played a role for the Greeks. And we've been talking about this a lot. It was in the paper that you guys wrote just the other day. This question of what it means to be mortal. What it means to use that as a polemic and organize it. The question of facing the fact that we're mortal. And how difficult it is for most people to face that. I personally think the reason the society is so screwed up is that most people would rather make a deal than face the fact of their own mortality. This is what most organized religion is. You follow these rules and we'll give you eternal life. Well, who's giving eternal life? The preacher? The one who's back in the back room stooping the organist? Where's this eternal life coming from? So you have these kinds of the deals that are made. The person who says, if I go to confession and then say 20 Hail Marys, it'll be forgiven that I cheated or that I did something wrong. That's sort of like had Odysseus said, I want immortality, I want earthly paradise, I want a goddess. What's wrong with that? Now, the point is that Odysseus achieved immortality the hard way. He fought. He had to learn something. He had to master universal physical principles. He had to escape what his men were too undisciplined to escape and to make it back home. And so you get a sense of this question when Lynn talks about this idea that the other day he said, it's not going to be easy to win this fight, as if we didn't know that. Mm-hmm. But there's no shortcut. You've got to keep at it every day. Whatever you're doing, you may not be doing the same thing every day, but whatever you're doing, you have to have this idea that you're fighting for something that's going to live beyond you. And so in this sense, to me, this question of mortality, and I've been thinking a lot about this over the last couple of years. I have to tell you, I didn't think too much about mortality. Lynn, when he first started the polemic on Hamlet, I thought it was interesting. But, I was of the sort who basically said, I'm 35 years old, I'm not worried about death. Mm-hmm. And you realize, what if people at the age of 15 already understood this question of mortality? What if classical culture was taught in such a way that these lessons that Homer taught, that Aeschylus taught, that Sophocles, Euripides, Plato, and Socrates, if these lessons actually became the guiding principles of a society, so that by 16 years old, when you're old enough to drive, you actually think about the question of mortality. Mm-hmm. And you have a sense of what the purpose of your life is. Think of what that would do to the dope pushers and the people who sell alcohol to underage kids and people who pawn off black market cigarettes to 12-year-olds. Imagine if people understood that their life was there for a purpose. And that you'd better get working on it before you're 65 or 70. Or before you get a preacher who says, we're going to wash you in the blood of the Lamb and your sins will be gone and you'll have eternal life if you pay enough at the door. So this question of mortality, it's really the greatest gift that was ever given to man. And this is an irony, isn't it? The fact that you're going to die, that you're not going to live forever. You can't just marry some goddess, become a stepson of Zeus or something like that. You actually have to work your ass off. And you're still going to die. And that's the greatest gift that's given to man. Now that's where Prometheus comes in. Think about Prometheus. Here's a guy who had it made. You know, he didn't have to risk anything. He had a pretty good life, presumably. You know, he was one of the titans. He could stride over mountains. He on top of everything else, he had foreknowledge. He knew what was going to happen. One of the things he knew that was going to happen is Zeus was going to wipe out the human race. You know, this is the background to the Prometheus story. Zeus, every once in a while, got tired of man. It was too hard to deal with their imperfections and the fact that they all weren't so subservient to him. So every once in a while, he decided to wipe them all out. You know, like Lord Jacob Rothschild or the Inter-Alpha Group. And here comes Prometheus, and he knows this is going to happen. And so Prometheus risks everything to bring fire to man, to bring knowledge to man. And what's the reaction of man? Cool. Thanks. They didn't change. They still acted like dirty, unwashed little animals in many cases. But Prometheus did it to give them enough power to survive. And Zeus, of course, went ballistic. But Zeus wasn't just mad because Prometheus intervened to save man, because he could have wiped man out sometime later if he wanted. What he was upset about is that Prometheus knew something about Zeus. Prometheus, as a forecaster, understood that the kinds of policies that Zeus enforced eventually would wipe out the gods. Prometheus was the first natural law forecaster, you might say. Yeah. Because he understood something that Zeus couldn't understand. Zeus obviously thought he was all-powerful. You know, Prometheus, by the way, helped Zeus overthrow his father. Yeah. Zeus's father was worse than Zeus, if you can imagine that. And Prometheus then felt betrayed because then Zeus came in and acted just like his father. So Prometheus acted knowing that he would be punished, knowing that he would suffer, knowing that he would suffer for a long time, every single day. Torment and torture. And knowing that most human beings wouldn't care. It would mean nothing to them. Because he was up in the Caucasus, they were down in Egypt and Mesopotamia and Sumer and beginning to spread into across the Aegean into Greece and up into Italy. They didn't know about this titan up in the mountains chained to a rock whose liver was being eaten every day by a buzzard, vultures, or a bunch of them. And so this is what the setting is when you begin the story. Everyone who's involved in this tries to convince Prometheus, give it up. Go ahead and tell him. Tell Zeus what he wants. You really want to suffer? Do you think these people care for you? What good did it do what you did? Did they listen to you? No. Zeus, he can help you. Zeus can do something for you. These dirty, unwashed people, they won't do a damn thing for you. So the guys forging the chains to tie him to the rocks, they're trying to talk him out of it. The chorus comes there, and the chorus says, what good is this for you, Prometheus? You're suffering while the people are out there doing what they ordinarily do. One after another, he's approached by people who are trying to convince him to give up the knowledge to Prometheus, to Zeus. Now my favorite is this poor schnook Hermes. Now, Hermes thinks he's really the good guy because he's Zeus's special messenger. He's supposedly fast. You know, he can travel great distances in a single bound. You know, he's given certain kinds of powers. Not enough powers to do anything to Zeus, but he actually thinks he's really, he's important. Hermes, by the way, was involved in the whole story with Odysseus. I don't remember exactly how. I think he was the one who was the messenger from Athena to Calypso that she has to let Odysseus leave. So Hermes gets a lot of the dirty work, but this is what gives him his power. He can go and say, Zeus said this is what you should do. So the mighty Hermes goes up to Prometheus and tells him, look, this is your last chance. Give it up and Zeus will let you go. And Prometheus is contemptuous. He said, I'd rather be chained to this rock than be a slave to Zeus. Now, Hermes, it wasn't the trash talk that got to Hermes. He knew he was in trouble because he was going to have to go back and tell Zeus he couldn't get the story. He couldn't clinch the deal. Now, you think about this point from Prometheus. You know, this idea that you'd rather face death than do something dishonorable, than to give up on a principle. You'd rather die. Think about a case that's a very interesting one, the case of Abraham Lincoln, who said explicitly that, you know, the Promethean president, in his, it was 1861, wasn't it, Phil? The address he gave on the commemoration in Philadelphia of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And he said, if I have to die to uphold these principles, I would rather do that than sacrifice these principles, give up these principles. That's someone who understood the principle of mortality and immortality. And Prometheus showed the same principle. Now, of course, he had foreknowledge. He knew eventually Zeus would fall. He knew he would be freed. He knew that the society would be changed, that this poor woman who was turned into a cow, who was sent up there to him, that she would eventually regain human form. She would have children. The children, after many, many generations, would settle into Greece, and one of them would be Hercules, who would come and free Prometheus. So he knew that, but that was a long way off. He didn't have to suffer for that long, but he did. Now, this is the whole point about mortality and immortality. This is what Schiller talks about in the Sublime. You're only free when you accept the consequences of mortality. When you recognize you're going to die, and that there are things more important than your physical body staying alive. This question of principle, this question of human willful determination to live for a higher purpose, for a principle. And it's there in Prometheus. And as Lynn pointed out in an article a number of years ago called Prometheus in Europe, this is the story of Jesus Christ. It's the same story. There are many great heroes, like Lincoln. You know, Lincoln actually did die for the principle, didn't he? He was murdered because he stood up against the British Empire. But the only way you become free is when you face your mortality. And you realize that as frightening as it is to have your physical existence ended, it's going to happen at some point anyway. And we really don't know when that's going to be. There's one interesting story on this, or other aspect on this Prometheus story, where early in the play, Prometheus talks about the fact that he freed people from knowing the day they were going to die. Supposedly, before Prometheus, people knew when they were going to die. And Prometheus took that away from them. Now, most of you would think, or not most of you, because you're better people than this, but most of the society would think, I'd like to know when I'm going to die, so right before it, I can squeeze in all the pleasure and degeneracy I can get before I go. Now, but Prometheus took that away from people. And they said, well, what gift did you give them to replace that? And he said, I placed in them hope. Hope. What kind of hope? That you'll always fight for something that's better. Even facing death, you fight. It's not that this understanding of mortality and immortality doesn't mean you welcome death. You walk around saying, go ahead and kill me, I stand for principle. I mean, you have to be smart. You have to be strategic. But it means you don't hold back because you might die by doing what's right. And that's what makes people free. And so I think this idea, when you look at this question of tragedy and immortality, there's some extremely powerful ideas here. And this last one, this question of giving people hope, not Obama-style hope, but real hope. Hope for what? That your life will have a meaning. And therefore, you fight for your life. Not just for yourself, but you fight for your life so that you'll be creative. That you'll take what you have of your mortal existence and do something with it to leave something for society, something better. Now, that's why I think this question of mortality is so powerful. That's why Lynn makes the point that it's not that Hamlet's afraid of his immortality. It's the question of his mortality, his dying. It's his immortality that scares him. This is what happened to Achilles. This is what happens to a lot of people. They're willing to just go out and get killed. Hamlet was a killer. Hamlet was reckless as could be. You can't say that he was worried about whether he's going to die or not. But you can be unconcerned about death and be crazy. That's not immortal. So this question of immortality is always attached to the idea of love of humanity in the future. And that you're going to make this your goal in life. Not just for yourself, but to give this gift to others, the way Prometheus did. I took away knowing when they were going to die, and I replaced it with hope. And that's powerful. So when you think about what's in this play, and you think about also why Lynn says we have to vindicate Mozart and the Don Giovanni question, you think about everything we do in organizing. What are we doing when we organize people? Are we saying, back us and you'll get a job? Support LaRouche and we'll get Glass-Steagall, and then maybe you'll see a bad banker go to jail? John Hofel's dreams? John and I have been trying to get bankers jailed since the 80s in Texas. They always jailed the wrong bankers. So, no, what is it that we want? Do we just want to go to Mars? No, this is the fight to extend the powers, the creative powers of the human race. And doing that with a love that transcends your love of your own physical existence. And that's ultimately what makes you free. And if that's the way you think, you can't be controlled by anybody. You're fully sovereign as a human being. And that's the gift we're giving to our contacts, whatever kind of bad habits they have. That's the gift we're offering to college students when we go on campuses. And they're trying to decide whether they're going to get a bong or pay for a book. They're stuck with the great existential crises questions of the day. And it was very interesting to me because this became a real question to me, not just with Susan's passing, but with reflecting on it from the standpoint of the Greeks. I think some of you saw the class I did about a year ago that I did throughout Europe on Prometheus, and I took up this question of immortality. And we were discussing this in a restaurant in Leipzig. It was in a park. It was a really cold, rainy night, but a few contacts were there, and our members were there, and there were these two young guys. One of them was sort of anti-nuclear, but I was going through, here's what we got to do in the world, here's how we're going to change history. And he said, well, but I'm sort of a practical guy. I want to know practically what I can do. What would be a practical thing for you to do? And I said, I've got just the thing for you. Become immortal. That's a practical question. And he got completely confused, and then he got excited. And he and his friend drove back with us from Leipzig to Dresden so he could be around for the next day to do some organizing and some talking. I don't know what ultimately happened with him. But this question of posing this to people, this is what Schiller does, especially in the Joan of Arc. The famous quote, "The brief is the pain, the joy shall be eternal." Dying is not a joyful thing. Neither for the person who's dying or the people who love them. What's the joy? That you knew the person. That you were with the person. That you experienced their fights. You were a part of those fights. And that you took up the fight after they were gone. And so this idea, it's a powerful idea if we can figure out how to communicate it in opera, for example, with the Don Giovanni. If you get an audience to actually have their stomach turning by the end of the opera. Because look, Mozart is very clever. He wrote beautiful music. There's no question about it. Some of these arias are so totally beautiful. But there's got to be another quality there. And what's the other quality? And this when we were talking last night at the dinner table, one of the things Lynn said is, well, it's not that you want to make it sound ugly. It's that you have to communicate from your mind something to the mind of someone in the audience. That there's something different there than a series of harmonic intervals. That the music is communicating the actual evil of a tragic society. And so if we can do this with opera, if we can do it with drama, with the Don Carlos, which is another perfect example. Who are the great figures in Don Carlos? Ultimately, the Inquisition wins. The Inquisition crushes everything. The powerful King Philip, the great King Philip of the Habsburg Empire in Spain, is a goddamn little puppet of the Inquisition. So I'll just finish with this point. What Lynn has said, which to me is the most powerful way of getting at this, is that almost all of human history has been tragedy. And right now we're living in a tragedy. You know, we're not an exception to that. We're living in a tragedy. The whole society doesn't have enough humanity to survive. The whole society is heading toward a wipeout of 2/3 or more of the human population. And we're living in that. Our members live in that society. We go shopping at the Giant with people who are going to die because they're too stupid to change. Our friends and family from before we joined may be nice people, but they're compromised. They're willing to accept a society that's doomed. And you talk to them about it and they say, well, that's your opinion. You say, well, I've studied this. I actually know something. Besides, I work with Lyndon LaRouche, who knows more than anyone in the world on this stuff. Well, I heard that he was a left-wing Nazi. You know, the things we get from people are so stupid. We just have to say, buddy, you're in a tragedy. I see you like Laertes in Hamlet. You're going down, buddy, unless you change. We were friends once, but I've changed. I'm not going to accept the tragedy. My life is going to have a purpose. And if we have that sense when we organize, it gives us this extra power. And so if you think of this thing of human existence has been tragic, there are few brief moments. The Charlemagne as an example. The Islamic Renaissance at its first point. The period of the people who were with Socrates. It ended tragically, but look what it gave us. The Renaissance, the work of Cusa. You know the pantheon. Now, how can we create a society where instead of a brief moment, there's durable survival of truly human beings? And I think this question of immortality is the key to that. Getting people to really understand that we're here for a brief moment, and that brief moment can be used for something beautiful that can last forever. Not just on this planet, but throughout the solar system and beyond. And so that's why I think the Prometheus project is a great thing. That's why I think the Don Giovanni represents something great. Because Lynn is trying to make classical culture something more than what we do when we're tired out from looking at science or organizing. Oh man, it was a hot day, let's go sing. You know, like we replace a dip in the pool with singing or something. No, what we're doing with this is that we're reasserting that potential to touch the immortality, the immortal potential of mankind. And so that's how we should approach all these things. And that's basically what I wanted to present. So